So now moving on to a little bit about the physical characteristics of the delta, the water that's flowing through it and so on. We call that the delta channel hydrology. What we found that was interesting is that basically most of the water moves through the delta to Lewis and Clark Lake through two primary channels. And there's one on the Nebraska side and one on the South Dakota side, basically right up against the bluffs on each side. So this is a picture of the channel on the Nebraska side. We're just a couple miles upstream of Santee here. And here is the delta itself, and then here are the bluffs on the south side of the river. So this channel in here is maybe about 200, 300 yards wide, but what was impressive was the depth of it. So at the time we were out there, the depth was about 20, 25 feet in a lot of places. So obviously a lot of the water is moving through here. The one on the South Dakota side was pretty similar, and when we were measuring it in 2012, it was pretty deep as well, but I think that it's subject to sedimentation as well, and I think it's probably a lot less deep now on the South Dakota side than it was right after the 2011 flood. But we also found that there's a lot of these minor channels, and that's really where there's a lot of water in the delta as well. Although it's not really moving the volume of water, but it's creating this unique delta habitat. These things are usually 20 yards wide or less, and the depth in them is often, maybe around 2 feet up to 4 feet. It's not very deep in here, and there's hardly any current that moves through here at all. And so here I just took a picture of these lily pads, which is a good indication that there's really no water velocity there. There's a little bit, you can't really tell it, but a little bit moves, but not enough. These lily pads, for example, tend to grow like in ponds and reservoirs where there's no water moving at all. Also, in 2012 and also into 2013, there was a lot of huge sand dunes like this in the delta that were deposits from the 2011 flood. So this was kind of a unique sight to see out there, these huge sand dunes. In the 5 years since the flood, though, a lot of these have been worn down by wind erosion and precipitation. And then also, once they start to wear down, vegetation takes over and starts to cover them up as well. So I think you'll find that there's not a lot of these sites left out there today. So this kind of gives you an indication of how complex the hydrology in the delta is. What I've mapped out here is the different types of channels. And the green ones are the primary channels. So those are the wider, deeper channels where the majority of the water is moving through. And so as you come from Niobrara and running water, the channel's over here on the Nebraska side, and then at some point it splits off. Part of it goes down the Nebraska bluff, but the other part heads over to Springfield, where it comes out just on the west end of Springfield. It hits the bluff and flows like that until it re-enters Lewis and Clark Lake. And there is another area just about at Santee where the channel splits off, and there was enough water moving through there that we considered that a primary channel as well. It was deep enough with some pretty good velocity. But for the most part, you're really limited to about 2 or 3 channels where the majority of that water is actually moving. The rest of them, these yellow and red ones, are just these minor channels that are ubiquitous throughout the delta. And this is where they're 2 foot deep, 4 foot deep, and not very wide at all, but there's just a large network of them. And I don't even have them all mapped out on here because there's just too many to map, but it gives you an idea of sort of how that network of channels works its way through the delta. So I want to show you a delta profile from just down here by the Standing Bear Bridge. You may have heard of these cross sections that the Corps of Engineers measures every once in a while to see what's happening to the riverbed. And so we looked at 5 or 6 of those between Niobrara and the leading edge of the delta when we did this study, and graphed them up so that we could understand how the riverbed down there is changing over time. So I'll just show you one tonight, and this one is it's right here just downstream of the Standing Bear Bridge. So I don't know if you can see it, but this is the bridge coming across the river. Just a little ways downstream is the profile that I'm going to show you. Basically what the profile shows us is it shows us what is the shape of the riverbed underneath the water. So what kind of a, where are the highs and the lows in the riverbed. So I'll start out with this slide. This is the South Dakota shoreline here, and on this side is the Nebraska shoreline. So we're looking at the shape of the riverbed underneath the water from the South Dakota to the Nebraska shoreline. The black line represents what that riverbed looked like in 1955. So that was the year the dam was closed, so it was not being impacted at all at that point by sedimentation. So basically, in that section of the river, there was a deep main channel that was pretty wide, close to the South Dakota side, and then just some smaller channels on the Nebraska side, but still channels deep enough that they would move some water. So those channels were probably 3, 4, or 5 feet deep, but there was several of them in there. By 1975, and that's what we see here in the green line, the shape of that riverbed right below the bridge turned to this. So you just had one channel, and it was very narrow, a very deep channel on the South Dakota side. This old channel that used to be there before the dam was put in is now completely filled in with sediment. So it took a pretty good amount of sediment to fill all that in, but it's been all filled in. And then we even have sandbars starting to show up above the water surface. And the rest of the river is pretty shallow in here as well. So that's sort of the change that took place in the first 20 years. The primary change was this old riverbed filled in. Now if we compare what the riverbed used to look like in 1955 to what it looks like after the 2011 flood. So this, again, the black line is what the river looked like in 1955. The red line is what the river looked like in the fall of 2011 after the flood was over. So you can see what has happened then basically in that time is the delta has really popped up, obviously, just below the Standing Bear Bridge. So where the red line is, here basically you have sediments above the water surface. So this is all the delta deposits that you see. Every once in a while there's another channel, little channel there. But again, there's really just one primary channel, and it's actually pretty deep. So right in here is a deep channel on the South Dakota side, just below the Standing Bear Bridge there. So looking at it from a map, and now let's look at it all the way from Niobrara to the leading edge of the delta here. What we found in analyzing those cross-sections all the way down the river is that in the first 10 years, even though, if you remember those original air photos and land satellite images I was showing you, in the first 10 years, it looked like there really wasn't any sediment problem that had developed because nothing was showing up above the water surface. But what those cross-sections tell us is that actually there was quite a bit of sediment being deposited. It's just that it wasn't enough to bring it above the water surface. But it was making the river and the lake shallower. And one of the primary places that it went was the old river channel. So this black dashed line right here shows where that 1941 river channel was at before the Lewis and Clark Lake was built. So, and in a lot of areas, that old river channel is still underneath the lake. What we found is that in the first 10 years, it was mainly that old river channel all the way from Niobrara to several miles downstream of Springfield that filled in with sediment. So all that sediment that was coming down and falling out of the river was settling down into that old river channel and filling it up in the first 10 years. Then in the 1970s, we suddenly started to see a lot of sediment showing up above the water surface. So basically, all the way from here to several miles downstream of Springfield, the delta built itself in the 1970s. In the 1980s and 1990s, it went from the leading edge at the end of the 70s clear out to here. And actually, a lot of that was due to the high flows in the mid and late 90s. And then since 1999, between 1999 and 2011, the delta has advanced into the lake this far, where you see the purple right here.